The Age of Jackson. This period of time in American history, often referred to as the Age of Jackson, begins with the election of Andrew Jackson as president and runs roughly through the end of his successor's term, Martin Van Buren. Uh, it's often seen as a period of great democratization. We've talked a little bit about that already happening during the era of good feelings, and that somehow Jackson is not only a symbol of this democratic impulse, but somehow this democratic impulse sort of flows from his presidency. I really don't know how true that is. And there are still questions about the increased democratic impulse. But we can start with his election. In 1828, Jackson ran for president again, ran once again against John Quincy Adams, and this time he won. Jackson ran as a Democrat this time, so that era of good feelings is now over. Clearly, there's party rivalry, hostility. One political party is not running everything anymore. And what you have is Jackson's presidency is also a bit of a vulgar turn. And when I say a vulgar turn, you can take it in both ways. One meaning a more common person turn, but also one in which perhaps a greater use of vulgarities than ever before in the White House. Jackson proclaimed that his task was to restore the old Jeffersonian republicanism, that farmers and craftsmen could pursue their individual liberties free of any government intervention that favored the rich and powerful. So the man who had somewhat been more favorable to democratic Republican policies during the era of good feelings, ideas of, some of this is going away, especially the embrace of the Bank of the United States. He wanted to remove elitism, vowing to make government service more responsive to popular will. You didn't need special training to hold a government job in his mind, just honesty and hard work. Now, most people think that therefore, because Jackson also embraced something called the spoils system of government. There's no civil service exam system in the United States at this time. So basically, the only way you get a federal government job that's not elected is to be appointed to one. And there's only one person who makes those appointments, and he's called the President of the United States. And so a important part of the president's job was often appointing people. Anything from the postmaster of Bangor to the Secretary of State. So it also gave the president a lot of ability to reward loyal party members. And a group like the Albany Regency and the Young Democratic Party certainly built their power off of this. And so Jackson, often noted for saying, to the victor go the spoils, meaning he wanted to use his power to appoint to reward local party supporters. In his mind, this was a way of getting people who thought like him in the right offices. It also was a way of, once again, rewarding loyal party members and a way of supporting that political machine. In all honesty, he actually only removed about 1/5 of the office holders, and most of his appointees came from the same status and backgrounds as former ones. But by instituting that spoils system, he's seen as someone embracing a wider democratic impulse, even though it's not like he was appointing lots of common men who, without much training or education, to those jobs, but he made it look as if he did. He also railed against the American system. His goal was to bind Americans together in a national market, but Jackson saw this as government favoritism, the American system. So, for example, in 1830, there was a Maysville Road bill, which would have built a road in Kentucky in the home district of Henry Clay. This was sort of a pet project of his. He made sure to veto that bill so Clay didn't get what he wanted. That rivalry was still there. Jackson was most popular in the West and in the South. His Indian policy made them see Jackson as a friend of the white settlers. He railed against the Second Bank of the United States, which also gained further support from Western farmers, because once again they saw that bank as the thing that ruined them in the Panic of 1819. And he saw it as, once again, another incursion into, basically the government overstepping its bounds. He fought the National Bank. He distrusted them after the Panic of 1819. There was not enough currency of any kind in circulation, he said. Banks issued worthless notes. They folded. The bank couldn't help out. Clay had supported and pushed in 1832 the renewal of the Second Bank of the United States Charter. Jackson vetoed the bank and then started to identify local banks, which were called pet banks, which were banks controlled by loyal Democrats, and deposited federal monies in those banks. So, once again, rewarding friends through a different kind of spoil system. It's not that they were the most common, but they were his supporters. The downside of this was that within a period of several years, he would be out of office. His successor, Martin Van Buren, would be president. And the high commodity prices that these banks helped to float and the abundant credit that they gave triggered another panic, the Panic of 1837, that eventually sunk his successor, Martin Van Buren. So his policy, while he was trying to stave off panic, actually invited another one. So you have this image of Jackson. Of course, Indian policy is the thing that one of the things that he's most noted for. When Jackson became president, roughly 125,000 Indians lived east of the Mississippi River, and there were 5 confederations: the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. And they all lived on land in the southeast U.S. that planters wanted. Southern planters wanted to expand, and they needed that land to expand, and they wanted the land that the Indians were living on. Southern states all pressured the government to clear the Indians off those lands, open them up to settlement after the War of 1812. The most intense pressure was in Georgia. And in 1825, Georgia had finalized a treaty with Indians that ceded most of the Creek lands to the state. This was a fraudulent treaty that was not made in good faith. In fact, it was corrupt as hell. However, President Adams at that time had attempted to obtain fairer terms for the Creeks, but he was denounced in Georgia, one of the things that wound up throwing support in the election of 1828 to Andrew Jackson, and threatened with action. He backed down, not wanting to any kind of armed conflict between a state and the federal government. And in 1828, Georgia took action against the Cherokees. The Cherokees were prosperous small farmers. They had made a written alphabet. They had schools for their children. And if you think back to, Indians having to fend off white incursion and intrusion, certainly in the West, Georgia certainly had its problems and fears about Indians on the borders. By 1827, the Cherokee had adopted a constitution declaring themselves independent and sovereign. Georgia responded by placing the Cherokees under state law, annulling Cherokee law and their right to make laws, and legally defining Cherokees as tenants on land belonging to the state of Georgia. They also prohibited Indian testimony in cases against white people. They stripped the Cherokees of any legal rights. And settlers scrambled to take Cherokee lands after gold strikes were found in the area in 1829. Alabama and Mississippi, those states followed Georgia's lead in denying Indians legal rights and doing the same sorts of things, which set the stage for what Andrew Jackson, by this time, who's president, believed what would be the most important measure of his first administration, the Indian Removal Act. So, in this case, what Jackson did was allowed state officials to override federal protection of Indians. In the first annual message, he sided with state authorities in the South, and he advised the Indians to move beyond the Mississippi River or submit to the laws of those states. This was important for his image because he wanted to appear as a friend of the Indians, sort of a father figure who would lead his children out of harm, while at the same time basically tell them to get out. Congress acted on this by passing the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It appropriated $500,000 for the negotiation of new treaties under which the Southern Indians would surrender their territory and be moved to land in the area of Oklahoma. The force was not authorized here, and Jackson stressed that removal should be voluntary, so no federal protection was provided for Indians being harassed by state agents, though. So while they said one thing, they didn't really do much to enforce it. And later, he did send the army, but only to round up and force out those Indians not complying with the treaty. The Choctaws were moved in 1830, the Creeks and Chickasaws in 1832, and the Cherokee in 1838. This is often referred to as the Trail of Tears, the forced march of the Cherokees, where thousands died on the march, and as many as 1/4 of all of those moved suffered from cold, hunger, and great mistreatment. Now, there were protests of Indian treatment in the government. One, Protestant missionaries lobbied hard and came within 3 votes of defeating the removal bill in the House. In the Supreme Court, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case heard in 1831, and the Worcester versus, I say Worcester because I'm living in New England, it's Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. The court ruled that Georgia had violated the Constitution by extending its jurisdiction over Indians. If you remember back to our discussion of the Constitution, one of the powers that the federal government reserved for itself, right, or one of those powers granted to the federal government, is the sole power to regulate Indian affairs. No state has that right. But in so doing, what Georgia was doing and all these states were doing was basically violating the Constitution willy-nilly, and no one was doing anything about it. But here it made it to the Supreme Court for a challenge, in which the court ruled Georgia had indeed violated the Constitution by extending its jurisdiction over Indians. They were, he said, dependent domestic nations, but only subject to federal regulation. Bringing up a major concern. What do you do then? If I was to ask you, how does the Supreme Court enforce its decisions? The Supreme Court has no authority to call up the Army to support its decisions. It can't issue a writ of mandamus, which it refused to do in Marbury versus Madison. So what happens? They rely on the executive office to enforce their decisions. And in this case, President Jackson said, well, that's great, ignored the ruling. And he said, the Supreme Court is powerless to change the situation, and he said, let the Supreme Court enforce their decision. So he had no interest in actually upholding it. Also in 1832, local militias and federal troops fought the Sauk and Fox Indians of Illinois and Wisconsin in something called the Black Hawk War. One young man got some military experience in the Black Hawk War, and it would be his sole military experience before becoming president during the next war. A major conflict in the United States. Abraham Lincoln was someone who fought a little bit in the Black Hawk War. So this is what Andrew Jackson wanted to be his defining moment. And, you know, as we look back, in hindsight, of course, it's one of the worst and most brutal. Crises. Now, we talked about the crises of the bank war that President Jackson fought. So I mentioned that again, the Second Bank of the United States being, not renewed by Jackson, one of the crises he fought. The other is really dangerous, but it was called the Nullification Crisis. In 1828, there was a 50% tariff hike passed in Congress. This is often called the Tariff of Abominations. So that meant the tariff rate was hiked by half of its value. So already you're talking about a tariff that's like 20 to 25% being put on goods. In this case, you're talking about hiking the tariff to like 10 to 13% additionally. So in this case you're talking about a 30, right? Like a 30% tariff hike to what? Like 48 or not 48, 38% tariff hike. So you're talking about a major, so you're talking about a tariff that could be as high as 38%. Southerners hated this tariff. They were the ones who called it the Tariff of Abominations, and it had a great deal of impact on the South. Why? Because their economy was based on slave labor plantations, used on plantations. And the South did not necessarily benefit from protective tariffs. What it did was hike up the price of goods that they purchased from England, and they had good trade relations with England as they traded their cotton and in return purchased European goods. But because of the protective tariff, all it saw was their money them spending more money for the same goods, and that money being funneled mostly to northern improvement projects. So they disagreed with it intensely. In South Carolina in 1832, John C. Calhoun quietly wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. This was his work, which basically said a state acting through a popularly elected convention had the right to nullify a federal law, and it remained unenforceable unless 3/4 of the states approved an amendment delegating to the national government the power in question. Then the nullifying state had the right to leave the Union. Basically, this becomes the genesis or the main source of a number of secessionist politicians in the United States and that idea. Where did Calhoun say he got his ideas from? Not just the Revolutionary War experience and everything else, but also the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that Madison and Jefferson had written. John C. Calhoun was the sitting vice president of the United States at the time. Right? He was the vice president for Andrew Jackson during his first term. So Jackson really wasn't very happy. It's also the reason he replaced him with Martin Van Buren on the ticket in the election of 1832. Calhoun always insisted that nullification was not secession. It was merely a way of protecting minority rights. However, he did say a nullifying state did have the right to leave the Union. So there is secession in there. Jackson was not at all happy. While he was friendly to Southern interest, he was not a secessionist. He dedicated his career to the preservation of the Union. He fought for the United States. He was a general in the U.S. Army, and now he's president, charged with protecting and preserving the Constitution. He said, "If a single drop of blood shall be shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States," that meaning South Carolina, "I will hang the first man I can lay my hand on engaged in such treasonable conduct upon the first tree I can reach." He also was noted for raising a toast during a dinner party, saying to our federal union, it must be preserved. Jackson actually resisted this, warned South Carolina that it had better collect that tariff and not nullify federal law. And in 1833, Congress passed the Force Bill, which became the Force Act, which basically authorized Jackson to use whatever force necessary to bring South Carolina into compliance. So this became a real standoff. But once again, while this is an argument over tariffs and everything else, the main issue at heart here is the fact that the slave economy that they have, this tariff hurts them. And they're trying to preserve their their well-being as they see it. What happens ultimately is that Jackson, while he has the Force Act pass and he signs it, he also works behind the scenes to generate a compromise tariff of 1833, in which Congress lowers the rates up to 20%. And scheduled further reductions over the next 10 years. So what he did was, while he was talking tough on the one hand, he was using that as a way of negotiating with South Carolina to back down. So what you have is Jackson, once again, remaining very committed to the Union, but at the same time trying to steer a course. He still had pro-Southern sympathies, but they didn't go as far as secession. Not at all. You also have slavery causing a number of crises in Congress and in the country that also, once again, threaten the peace. In 1831, a slave named Nat Turner had plotted a rebellion in Virginia in which he was going to arm and liberate other slaves, and they were going to overthrow their masters. This plot was foiled, and eventually those slaves were captured and executed. And what it did was raise a great deal of fears in the South. And one of the other things it did is prompted the South to increase the sizes of their state militias and start drilling more regularly. So the South takes these threats very seriously. There's also more restrictive laws being passed against slaves and harsher punishments being used to discipline slaves to prevent insurrections, especially very hard punishments, felony punishments for anyone teaching their slaves to read or to write, because Teaching them to read or write could mean that they could use code or written words to transmit secret messages. So, seen as a way of preventing insurrections, this was not allowed. But in the North, you also start to have a greater embrace of abolitionist sentiment. For example, in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison becomes a newspaper editor who starts a newspaper called The Liberator, which is a dedicated abolitionist newspaper. Southerners are outraged by this and certainly up in arms. But what you start to see is that the slavery discourse doesn't really go away. And in 1836, Congress passed that gag rule we talked about before. But that gag rule is passed in 1836. What we'll see is that very quickly, over the next period of next 10 years, you're going to start to see that rule attacked more often and eventually removed. But the idea was that by putting aside a discussion of slavery, you would avoid something that would be unpleasant and threaten to interfere with the business of the United States and the Union. So both sides were still agreeing to disagree and not talk about it. Following Jackson's 2 terms, his new vice president, Martin Van Buren, ran on his own right for the presidency in 1836, the same year the gag rule passed. Van Buren was not Jackson. While he was a skilled politician and certainly good at putting together a political machine, Van Buren struggled as a president. We'll see he tries to annex Texas, which doesn't work. There's not support for it. But also, the main thing is that his administration is basically sunk in the first year of office with the Panic of 1837. He's seen as weak and ineffective. At the same time, a ship called the Amistad comes ashore at Montauk, and it is a case that is followed in the United States, in which a group of Africans had been illegally enslaved by a Spanish slave vessel and taken because the international slave trade was effectively banned, and those slaves were, people were taken and enslaved and going to be sold. The group of Africans who were enslaved mutinied on the ship, took control of it, and forced the surviving crew to help navigate them back to Africa. What the crew did was actually sail them to America. When they came ashore, one of the arguments that happened was, were these in fact slaves or were they born free? And after a series of trials, it was discovered that indeed these had been free people who were illegally enslaved. And the sides picked in this case reflected some of the tensions within the United States over slavery. In parts of the North, abolitionist societies and other Americans supported the immediate release and freedom of these Africans and their return to their home. A number of Southerners sided with the Spanish government, who demanded the return of their ship and the return of its cargo, meaning those slaves. So it became a pressure point. President Van Buren, under pressure from Southern partisans such as John C. Calhoun, who was pressuring Martin Van Buren to give back the ship and the slaves to the Spanish government. The Spanish were sending emissaries demanding it. However, the Supreme Court was not going to hear that. The case of the Amistad came to the Supreme Court, and Andrew Jackson's appointee to the Supreme Court, who became the Chief Justice who replaced the great John Marshall, a guy named Roger B. Taney. His last name is pronounced Tawney. His last name is spelled T-A-N-E-Y, Taney, but it's pronounced Tawney. Roger B. Taney, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, found in favor of the Amistad crew. Well, not the crew, but the Amistad mutineers, who basically he decided and found that they had been born free, illegally enslaved, and they were to be set free immediately. They were free men. So what happened is that for years, pro-Southern supporters had actually tried to pass legislation in the Congress to compensate the Spanish for the loss of the ship and the cargo, what they called the cargo, which was the slaves. Northerners wouldn't hear of it, and since they outnumbered the South in Congress, this appropriation never took off. But what we also see is that this issue isn't going away, and in spite of the gag rule, this discourse, this conversation is going on in the Supreme Court and other places, and Americans are certainly not in agreement, as evidenced by William Lloyd Garrison. So just as more Northerners start to stick their feet in harder and harder, more Southerners are doing the same. And eventually we'll see the end of the gag rule in Congress and see what happens there. You also have a rise of a new political party, the old Democratic Republicans, the party of John Quincy Adams, the party of Henry Clay. That goes away and they become the Whigs. So just as the Democratic Party arose in 1828, you have the Whig Party arising. And they start to use the concept of the Jackson persona, but combine it with the American system. So what they wanted to appeal to voters with was the self-made man Western concept, but so that same kind of persona as Jackson, but they wanted someone who would embrace the American system. Internal improvements, Bank of the United States, that sort of thing. In the election of 1840, the party dumped the idea of running Henry Clay, instead to embrace their own war hero, Jackson-esque type war hero, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison ran for president, and his nickname, Tippecanoe, and his vice president, John Tyler, was a former Democrat, and he was a Southerner from Virginia. He broke with Jackson over the force bill. And so what the idea would be that by having this Democrat who would be the running mate, or former Democrat as the running mate, you also have William Henry Harrison, who's a Westerner, right? He's from Indiana. He's a Westerner. And you have John Tyler, who's a Southerner and a former Democrat. So you would balance the ticket so the geographic area, major geographic areas would be satisfied. And he had broken with Jackson over the force bill, and he was seen as a Southern partisan to balance that ticket. This backfired because Harrison won the election and died within 1 month of taking office, and John Tyler became the president. Except John Tyler was never a committed Whig. He just went to the Whigs because he disagreed with what Jackson did with the force bill, meaning he didn't like the idea Jackson was going to use, had the right to use force to compel South Carolina to obey the law. So what happened is ultimately Tyler became a president who was supposedly a Whig, but was really acting as a Democrat and fighting with the Whig majority in Congress all the time. In 1836, while this is going on, Americans living in the Republic of Texas, they were slaveholders, and they declared independence from Mexico. They were actually Americans, most of them, who had moved to Texas and to start plantations. They were slaveholders, and the Mexican government allowed them to live there. They started to bristle under Mexican rule, and many of them disliked the relationship of Catholicism to the state. And they had asked, after declaring independence, for U.S. annexation. Well, by 1837, Martin Van Buren certainly wanted to, but really couldn't. No one really supported it, and he had his own problems with the panic. So, in 1844, you have another issue where you have James K. Polk, the Democrat winning office. John Tyler, a Democrat at heart, but a Whig in name, says, yep, people are going to agree. Polk had in part run on the idea of annexing Texas and making it an American territory. Tyler preempted him, saying, hey, well, I can start this ball early while I'm finishing out my term, and had used the moment to annex Texas. Why is this a big deal? Annexing Texas. Texas was a big territory. It was also still technically sort of at war with Mexico. Mexico wanted their territory back, and weren't going to let it go. By annexing it, the United States was basically putting itself in a position to come into conflict with Mexico. But why would Americans want Texas? Mostly Southerners wanted Texas because they saw it as a logical place to expand, slave plantations and Southern cash crop farming. So they saw this as a way of expanding their influence, expanding their population and political influence in the Congress, and the expansion of their livelihood. To many Southerners, being unable to expand the plantation system meant basically a threat to their way of life because they could not politically defend it. They would be outnumbered. They would become politically a minority in the country, and they didn't see themselves as that. So, by the election of 1844, you have this new feeling in America, and Texas does get annexed. And we will see what it brings on the United States in terms of expansion. You also have a great deal of growth by this time of railroads. At first, railroads have a slow start, but eventually, forgive the pun, pick up steam over the 1830s. So if you remember back, the first major railroad company in the United States was the Baltimore and Ohio, opening a 13-mile track in 1830. Usually these short tracks were used to connect water routes. And if lines met, they were often of different gauges, so the width of the track were different, so they weren't standard yet. So this doesn't really help all that much. In 1840, train trackage was under 3,000 miles. However, within 20 years, by 1860, 27,000 miles of train tracks in the United States. The Northeast had the best system, and the South had the worst. Chicago had the best system in the West, which was served by 15 different train lines. And there becomes a growing reliance upon railroads, which takes away from the canal system, but it can move more cargo. It also further lessens the relationships between farmers and their direct means of transport. This would become the primary mode of transport for goods and for people, in many cases, moving west. Important companies develop, so highly capitalized, very powerful companies. They also do things like standardized time, schedules, the flow of goods. They develop new ideas of corporate management and introduce new ideas about double entry bookkeeping. So they also update their practices to what we would consider to be, the genesis of modern corporate activity. It also goes hand in hand with economic expansion, industry, the rise of industry, and serving this large territory, and becomes a symbol of America's growing technological ability. By 1832, telegraphs become more of a reality. Basically, Samuel Morse, a professor of art at NYU, with an amateur interest in science, began working on a system of electrical communication and developed Morse code. By 1835, he had a system of electrical communication and began promoting it. In 1843, Congress appropriated $30,000 to build an experimental line between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. By May of 1844, Morse had successfully demonstrated his telegraph. And by 1860, there were more than 50,000 miles of telegraph line. By 1861, Pacific Telegraph opens with 3,595 miles of line between San Francisco and New York City. And by then, most independent operators joined together into one service called the Western Union Telegraph Service. This also helped facilitate the growth of railroads, enabling railroads to stay in better communication with their central offices. You also have the rise of newspapers. With the rise in telegraphs and railroads, it helped bring news faster. With the growth of cities, you also have the growth of newspapers. By 1846, Richard Hoe invented the steam cylinder rotary press, making it possible to print newspapers faster and cheaper. And it was the beginning of mass circulation newspapers. The New York Sun was the most widely circulated paper, which had 8,000 readers in 1834. By 1860, its successful rival had 77,000 readers. And what we'll see by the turn of the century, by 1900, you're going to talk about even more innovations which make newspapers super mass available, with much wider circulations and newspaper networks, basically, and chains of newspapers. You also have class issues, and you'll see some of that, obviously, with the discussion on Christmas and class, but you also see an anti-immigrant backlash in the United States. Since a number of immigrants coming were immigrants willing to work for low wages and competed for jobs with native-born, it started to create a backlash. And some people argued that they were racially inferior. There was also a great deal of anti-Catholic sentiment. Many Americans feared that Catholics would show greater allegiance to the Pope and their religion than their country. And some, by the later 1800s, some places even feared that Catholics were planning a secret uprising to overthrow the United States. For example, in the 1890s, the mayor of Toledo had actually appropriated money to purchase arms from the Winchester Company to put them in an armory in the city of Toledo, because he was planning to need those weapons to hand out to loyal citizens when the Catholics finally staged their revolt. To him, he was fully convinced that Catholics were planning a secret revolution, and he was just preparing himself for when it happened. So there was a great deal of anti-Catholic sentiment, and this quickly wrapped into politics. There's a group called the Native American Association. This is not an association for American Indians. The people are organizing this group in 1837. They are white Protestant Americans born in the United States. The Native American Association, founded in 1837, promoted anti-immigrant policy. In 1845, it became the Native American Party. Once again, people who were born in the United States who were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. By 1850, it joined with other nativist groups to form the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. They advocated a political agenda that wanted to ban Catholics from public office, enact more restrictive naturalization laws, and implement literacy tests for voting. So what you see is this incredible anti-immigrant backlash in this fear, but what you have is this old system, as we talk about, sort of eroding, going away. And as you have this labor pattern changing, especially in the industrialized North, you also have these new racial sensibilities developing and playing out there as well. But what you have is, while the Age of Jackson is seen as this great time of democratization, in many ways, while there's certainly greater participation, and with the arrival of newspapers, greater place for political discourse and knowledge, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a more vibrant democracy in any way possible. While in some cases politicians must be more beholden to their constituencies, you still have major social issues being covered up with the gag rule, where there's clearly disagreement, and you also have the status of American workers, which you've seen in the Christmas in Class and some other things. Certainly, limiting people's definition of democracy, or at least the idea of equality and opportunity. So it's more than just having a broader political participation. Jackson was talking about the common man, this being a victory for the common man. But how is it a victory for the common man when they lose their property, they can't farm, and they wind up working for a wage, which is something that Jefferson had always considered to be slavery. A number of the founders had considered to be slavery, but by the end of the Age of Jackson, factory work is commonplace and accepted in the United States. Wage earning is there. There's no longer social responsibilities to their other people. So while there may be wider spread political participation, it doesn't mean that they've done much by way of addressing issues of equality for whites, for immigrants, or for African Americans.